The moment Piers Morgan stopped talking about Meghan Markle as a celebrity controversy and started talking about her as a mystery, everything changed. Because according to Morgan, this was never just about one interview, one disagreement, or one explosive television moment. He believes it became something much bigger, something that kept growing because every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. Every explanation appeared to leave another loose end, and every attempt to close the story somehow made people look even harder.
It's about whether you think the birth was real, whether you think there was a surrogate, whether you think Meghan was wearing a moon bump. The fact is, Harry and Meghan lied. Buckingham Palace lied on their behalf. There was a complete cover-up over the birth of Prince
pregnant at all. Instead, the videos embolden conspiracy theorists. They're calling it Megspiracy, and the pair are being subjected to yet more merciless ridicule.
This is absolutely insane that they thought they could get away with it, especially Meghan Markle and Harry. The con of the century, 2 cons of the century in the form of 2 royal children included in the line of succession.
Now, the lie. And by the way, Meghan, if you don't like me calling you a liar, just sue me. And we'll go through all this.
What makes this entire saga so fascinating is that it refuses to die. Most royal controversies burn brightly and then disappear. This one keeps coming back. Different year, different headline, same questions. And that's exactly what caught Piers Morgan's attention. When the backlash over his comments about Meghan exploded, many people assumed his career battle with the Duchess of Sussex had reached its final chapter. More than 57,000 complaints reportedly flooded it. Pressure mounted. Public outrage intensified. The narrative seemed settled, but Morgan wasn't moving on. Instead, he started looking backward, and that's where things became interesting. Because according to Morgan, the real story wasn't the public argument everyone could see. It was what was allegedly happening behind closed doors. The complaints, the pressure, the conversations, the decisions, the pieces nobody could fully see. Then another detail emerged. The reports that Meghan had allegedly raised concerns directly with it. To some people, that sounded completely reasonable. To others, it sounded like influence. To Morgan, it became evidence that something larger was unfolding.
Rejected by Meghan Markle. It's so utterly ridiculous. And yet people like you promote these scurrilous rumours.
But there's got to be a reason that you're so angry about.
No, I'm not angry with it. Here's my thing with it. I'm angry at their hypocrisy. I'm very angry about the ongoing attacks and diminishing of the reputation of the royal family.
That was the moment he began framing the entire controversy differently. Not as a personal feud, not as a media dispute, but as a battle over what questions people were allowed to ask. And once he adopted that position, he never backed away from it. Years passed. Interviews came and went. Headlines changed. Yet Morgan continued returning to the same point. Why, he asked, were certain subjects treated as untouchable? Why were some questions considered unacceptable the moment they were raised? And perhaps most importantly, what wasn't being discussed?
Harry and Meghan, it's more a case of never reign and never abstain, especially when it comes to nauseating self-publicity, which invariably backfires.
That question would eventually lead directly into one of the most controversial subjects attached to Harry and Meghan's entire public story. The pregnancies, the baby bump, the photographs, the timelines, the speculation. And suddenly, the debate became explosive, because once people started looking, they didn't stop looking. One photo became 10 photos. One appearance became 20 appearances. One observation became an online investigation involving thousands of people, and every new image seemed to fuel another round of arguments. Supporters insisted people were obsessing over absolutely nothing. Critics insisted they were noticing details that deserved attention. Neither side was willing to surrender. Then came one of the moments that poured gasoline on an already raging fire, the now famous dancing hospital video. For supporters, it was harmless, fun, a private family memory shared publicly. For critics, it reopened old conversations that many thought had already faded away. And that's the pattern that kept repeating. Every time Meghan attempted to show something personal, another wave of scrutiny seemed to follow. Every photograph, every podcast, every interview, every appearance, the discussion kept returning. Why? Because comparisons started emerging. People looked back at how royal pregnancies had traditionally unfolded. When Catherine welcomed her children, the public witnessed a carefully familiar royal process. Hospital steps, photographs, predictable timelines, visible milestones. There was very little room for mystery. With Meghan, then everything felt different, more private, more controlled, more selective. And whenever information becomes limited, curiosity fills the vacuum. That's human nature. Before long, online communities were analyzing photographs frame by frame. People zoomed in, compared images, created timelines, shared side-by-side screenshots. Some believed they were finding inconsistencies. Others argued they were simply seeing camera angles, lighting differences, clothing choices, and natural changes during pregnancy. The arguments became endless, but the debate wasn't driven by one image. It was driven by accumulation, 100 small observations becoming one giant controversy. Then attention shifted again, away from photographs, toward movement, toward body language, toward appearances. Some viewers believed Meghan appeared extremely protective of her stomach during certain public events. Others noticed moments where she seemed energetic and unrestricted. Supporters dismissed these observations immediately. Critics added them to their growing collection of unanswered questions, and every side believed they were following the evidence. Then another controversy arrived. The announcements, the timing, the palace statements, the corrections. When details surrounding Archie's birth became public, some observers noticed discrepancies between early reports and later clarifications. Suddenly, people weren't only discussing photographs anymore, they were discussing timelines, records, communications, official statements. And once timelines become part of a controversy, things become much harder to contain because timelines create patterns, patterns create theories, and theories create entire online communities dedicated to proving them. That's exactly what happened. Forums exploded, blogs appeared, social media threads multiplied. Entire groups began documenting every public appearance, every statement, every date. Some people became convinced there were major unanswered questions. Others became convinced that ordinary events were being transformed into conspiracy theories. The divide grew wider. And then one particular rumor emerged, the surrogacy speculation, a rumor that critics say refuses to disappear no matter how many years pass. Supporters called it outrageous. Critics claimed Harry and Meghan's handling of information helped fuel it. Neither side agreed on anything except one fact. The story was getting bigger, much bigger, and that growth fascinated Piers Morgan, because from his perspective, the issue was no longer whether one specific claim was true or false. The issue was why so many questions continued surviving year after year. Why did old debates keep returning? Why did people keep revisiting the same events? Why were screenshots from years earlier still circulating online? Why were old interviews still being dissected? Why were people rebuilding timelines years after the fact? According to Morgan, that's what transformed a royal controversy into something else entirely. A credibility debate, a trust debate, a narrative debate. And the deeper he looked, the more convinced he became that the story wasn't ending. It was evolving. Every answer seemed to create another mystery. Every clarification appeared to generate fresh scrutiny. Every attempt to close the chapter somehow opened a new one. And just when it looked like the speculation surrounding Meghan's pregnancies had reached its limit, attention started moving towards something even bigger. The birth itself, the changing reports, the questions surrounding Frogmore Cottage, the Portland Hospital revelations, and a series of details that would push the controversy into an entirely new phase. And that is where the controversy stopped being about photographs and started becoming a battle over trust itself. Because once people begin questioning timelines, they rarely stop at one date. Once they begin comparing statements, they rarely stop at one interview. And once they start believing there may be missing pieces, every new development suddenly looks like another clue. The focus returned to Archie's birth. Before the arrival, widespread reports suggested Harry and Meghan were considering a more private approach, with speculation centering around the possibility of a home birth at Frogmore Cottage. At the time, it fit perfectly with the image they were presenting to the world. Independent, private, determined to do things differently from the traditional royal playbook. Then something changed. Archie was reportedly born at Portland Hospital in London. For most people, that should have been the end of the story. Birth plans change every day. Medical situations change. Families change their minds. But critics weren't focused on the change itself. They were focused on what they saw as the absence of a clear explanation. Suddenly, old reports were being dug up again. Earlier articles resurfaced. Timelines were rebuilt from scratch. The internet began performing its favorite activity, connecting dots. And once the dots started connecting, the speculation exploded. Supporters insisted the public had absolutely no right to detailed explanations about private medical decisions. Critics countered that when public information situation changes repeatedly, questions become inevitable. Neither side moved an inch. Then another major turning point arrived, the Oprah interview. For Harry and Meghan's supporters, it was a powerful and emotional account of life inside the royal institution. Millions watched as Meghan described isolation, pressure, and emotional struggles. The interview immediately became one of the most talked about royal moments in modern history. But critics were already viewing everything through a different lens. Instead of accepting every claim at face value, they began comparing the interview against years of reports, stories, and palace accounts that had accumulated in the background. Suddenly, the debate wasn't simply about what Meghan was saying. It was about whether different versions of the story could coexist. Reports began circulating about palace schedules, staff accommodations, meetings, and internal efforts allegedly made to support Meghan during her time as a working royal. Or critics pointed to those reports and argued they painted a dramatically different picture. Supporters responded that official records cannot measure a person's emotional experience, and that became the heart of the conflict. Both sides were looking at the same period. Both sides were reaching completely different conclusions. Piers Morgan repeatedly returned to that exact point. According to him, the growing gap between public narratives and behind-the-scenes reports was impossible to ignore. Every time new information surfaced, the divide seemed to widen. Instead of resolving disagreements, new details only created more competing interpretations. Then the discussion shifted again, away from specific events, toward credibility. Morgan argued that the controversy had evolved beyond individual allegations and become a larger question about how public narratives are constructed, protected, and challenged. He repeatedly suggested that many critics felt certain topics had become difficult to question without immediately attracting backlash. That argument generated enormous controversy on its own. Supporters viewed it as unfair and overly suspicious. Critics saw it as a legitimate concern. Yet regardless of where people stood, the debate continued growing. What made the situation even more unusual was Harry's relative silence on many of the allegations circulating online. Supporters viewed that silence as the correct response to rumors that didn't deserve attention. Critics interpreted the same silence as avoidance. The exact same action was being interpreted in two completely opposite ways. And that is precisely why the story never disappeared. Old clips kept resurfacing. Old interviews kept being reanalyzed. Old statements kept being compared against newer ones. The controversy became self-sustaining. Every time it appeared finished, someone uncovered an old interview, rebuilt a timeline, compared photographs, revisited a statement, or highlighted another contradiction. Fairly or unfairly, the cycle continued. For critics, each unresolved question added another layer of doubt. For supporters, every new accusation represented another example of excessive scrutiny directed at Meghan and Harry. And somewhere between those two positions sat a growing number of observers who weren't fully convinced by either side. They weren't ready to accept every allegation, but they weren't dismissing every question either. That middle ground became increasingly important because it showed how the conversation was evolving. The debate was no longer divided into simple supporters and critics. More people were beginning to examine the details for themselves. That is why Piers Morgan believes the controversy endured for so many years, not because of one photograph, not because of one interview, not because of one rumor, but because dozens of separate controversies gradually merged into a single larger argument about trust, perception, and credibility. And that may be the most remarkable part of the entire story. Years later, people are still examining the same events and reaching completely different conclusions. Some see a couple relentlessly targeted by speculation. Others see a public narrative filled with unanswered questions. The facts being discussed are often the same. The conclusions could not be more different, and perhaps that's why this debate refuses to disappear. Because the real mystery is no longer Meghan, Harry, Piers Morgan, the interviews, the photographs, or the timelines. The real mystery is why one story created two completely different realities in the minds of the people watching it. And until that question is answered, this controversy may never truly end.